of the Hebrew University's Northeast region. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual program, which is just a sample of how we're working to bring the academic research of our esteemed faculty to you. Please visit our website, afhu.org, to learn about future events and to contribute to support our students and faculty. For our conversation today, Talking to Strangers and the Future of American Policing, I want to encourage you to write your questions using the Q&A feature. It is now my distinct honor to introduce Professor Daphna Lewinsohn-Zamir, Dean of the Faculty of Law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Professor Lewinsohn-Zamir, the first woman to be appointed to this prestigious position, is a world-renowned legal expert. She's also the Lewis Marshall Professor of Environmental Law at the Hebrew University. Professor Lewinsohn-Zamir holds degrees in law from the Hebrew University and is the recipient of many prizes and awards, including the Fulbright Scholarship, the Rothberg Fellowship, the Hebrew University President's Prize for the Excellent Young Scholar, and the Zeltner Prize. Welcome, Professor Lewinsohn-Zamir.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Maura, for the generous introduction. So, welcome. I wish I could meet you face to face, but since this is currently impossible, I'm grateful for the opportunity of a virtual get-together. I want to thank the American Friends of the Hebrew University for their long-standing dedication and for organizing what promises to be a terrific event. And I want to thank all of our donors, including those who are supporting our Torch of Learning Award, for their invaluable commitment and generous support of both Hebrew University and its law faculty. I am delighted that on September 15th, our 50th annual Torch of Learning Award will celebrate the wonderful achievements of Martin Lipton, an eminent attorney and founding partner of the law firm Wachter Lipton, Rosen & Katz. So, yishar koach to him. It will not surprise you if I say that we are living in very challenging times. The coronavirus pandemic has highlighted and intensified social divides in many countries, including Israel and the United States. Increased civil unrest has regrettably led to violence and bloodshed, often involving the police. Governments all over the world are eagerly seeking ways to deal with the situation. I am therefore excited that joining us today to discuss these timely issues are two giants in their fields, David Weisburd and Malcolm Gladwell. The law faculty at the Hebrew University is the flagship of legal research and education in Israel. According to the latest Shanghai International Ranking of Law Schools, we are not only ranked first in Israel, but also 33rd in the entire world. Without doubt, one of our brightest stars is Professor David Weisburd. David is a world leader in the areas of crime and justice and policing. He was the head of our Criminology Institute for many years, and his path-breaking research has advanced the field of criminology, both in theory and in practice. David's scholarly contributions were recognized by his receiving the most prestigious award, the Israel Prize and the Stockholm Prize in Criminology, which is regarded as the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in Criminology. Malcolm Gladwell is an immensely important and influential writer and a deep thinker. He is the author of several New York Times bestsellers and was included in the Time 100 Most Influential People list. Malcolm is also the co-founder of Pushkin Industries, producer of the podcast Revisionist History, which reconsiders things both overlooked and misunderstood. Malcolm's latest book, Talking to Strangers, What We Should Know About the People We Don't Know, was chosen as the best book of the year. It examines the crucial issue of our interactions with strangers, exploring the assumptions and mistakes we make in dealing with them, and illuminating why these interactions often go wrong. The conversation between David and Malcolm promises to be fascinating, and I am delighted that its moderator is Professor Barak Medina, the Rector of the Hebrew University. Now, Barak is not only the academic head of the Hebrew University. He is an esteemed member of the law faculty, where he holds the Justice Haim Cohn Chair in Human Rights. Barak is a renowned expert in constitutional law and economic analysis of law. He has written several books and numerous articles, including the definitive book on Israeli constitutional law. A graduate of the Hebrew University, Harvard Law School, and Tel Aviv University, Barak has served as visiting professor in leading law schools such as Columbia and Berkeley. He has also won prestigious prizes such as the Justice Cheshin Prize for Excellence in Legal Research. So, without further ado, let me pass on the virtual microphone to the Rector, Professor Barak Medina. Thank you all for your attention and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you so much, Daphna. Thanks for joining us. I'm thrilled to hold this conversation with Malcolm and David. Malcolm is my commute buddy for several years now through his Revisionist History podcast. I constantly learn from Malcolm's insights. And David served as my private mentor almost 20 years ago when I first arrived to the university, and this bond goes with us ever since. David has recently published two important books on policing, on proactive policing and on police innovation, and we will shortly discuss some insights presented in these books. We will start over with Malcolm's recent book, as Daphna mentioned, Talking to Strangers, What We Should Know About the People We Don't Know. We will discuss some aspects of David's work and its influence on Malcolm's book, and then in the second part of our discussion, we will touch on aspects related to the current situation in the US. Malcolm's new book is rich with insights, and I highly recommend it. I take from the book two main arguments, one about efficacy and the other about fairness and trust, and we will start with the first aspect of efficacy. And this argument consists, as I understand it, two important insights. One insight is that we humans are systematically wrong in our interpretations of other people. These are the strangers in the book's title. We misunderstand their intentions. We are bad in identifying when a person is lying, in evaluating the risk that a suspect poses. And we are often wrong in our assessment what might help in reducing the risk of that a person will commit crime, commit suicide, and other aspects. And Malcolm points out, and this is his other insight about efficacy, that realizing that we are often wrong should bring about a change in the way our systems work. And this realization should induce us not only to be much more modest. In Malcolm's words, what is required of us is restraint and humility. The main insight in this respect is that social institutions, such as the criminal justice system, should rely much more heavily, not on our intuitions, but on evidence-based policy, on the work of research psychologists, on criminologists like David and his colleague Larry Sherman and many others. And I suggest, Malcolm, that you will start by sharing with us the influence of David's work on coupling and hotspot policing on your thinking. And then I suggest that you will move to discuss the tragic case of Sandra Bland, with which you both start and conclude the book, and ask you to refer to some of the lessons that we should learn from this tragic incident. Malcolm, please.
Yeah, it's first of all, a pleasure to be invited to speak in this forum. And you're absolutely right that Professor Weisburd's work was central to my own book. In fact, I think of myself as Professor Weisburd's publicity agent. So the thinking is, once you understand that the task of making sense of a stranger, particularly under high pressure situations, where time is limited, where there are stakes are high, where there's a threat of violence, where you can name, when you understand how difficult it is for a law enforcement officer to accurately diagnose the person that he or she is dealing with, then the logical conclusion that you have to draw is that policing is hard, and so that means police officers have to be careful. They have to be restrained in how they use force and how they use their own authority, because the opportunity for error is so large. And the question is that raised by that is, if police officers are required to be restrained and careful in their use of authority, how do they maintain the peace? And the answer to that puzzle is in Professor Weisburg's work, that this notion that crime is something that is tied to a very small number of locations in any urban area. That, I've forgotten what the exact, that 1% or 2% of city blocks may account for over 50% of crime in a given area. That insight, that how localized criminal behavior is the answer to the puzzle. It says that you don't have to police the entire population with the same intensity. Rather, you can focus your efforts on just those specific parts of an urban area where criminality is concentrated. And so there is an elegant, in his work and the work of Larry Sherman, there is a kind of elegant solution to this puzzle of how do we act how does law enforcement act if the very task they are given is so difficult? And the answer is they focus their efforts on areas where the cost of mistakes is lowest, where the amount of crime is greatest.
And I think that, I actually think when Malcolm said publicity agent, I always thought when I read his book, he said it better than me, I started quoting him. But I think it's also the case that it just makes sense. The FBI once took my work and said, well, it's like going to the ocean. Where do you fish? You fish where the fish are. So in this case, crime is extraordinarily concentrated in cities. There's no point in spreading police across those cities. And that is, I just want to comment that one of the things I like about Malcolm's book very much is it begins with Sarah Bland, and I know you asked him to go back to it. That's a very Jewish thing, the approach that Malcolm takes. He starts with a single individual who was treated in a terrible way and ended up with terrible consequences. In the Talmud, when it talks about how do we get people to understand that testimony is important in a capital case, we say to the witnesses, taking a single human life is as if you destroyed the world, and saving a single human life is if you save the world. So Malcolm's use of that one event then to go on and say, what can we do about it? I think is a wonderful way. And I'll just make one more comment. It's also a way to help the police in a sense. One related problem, what do the police do when they get those hot spots? Well, the police need to think about that idea of how important each single human life is. That would help in our situation at the moment.
Yeah. I should explain the Sandra Bland case a little more, because it does bear. So this was before George Floyd. There were a couple of years ago, there were a string of cases, high-profile cases involving African Americans and law enforcement in the United States. And one of those was this case that I chose to highlight, which involved a woman named Sandra Bland, who was coming from a job interview in a small Texas town, pulled over by the police for essentially a made-up reason, got into an argument with the police officer, who then pulled her from her car, put her in jail, and she committed suicide 2 days later. And it was a classic example of an inappropriate use of police authority. They created a case out of nothing. Totally innocent woman fell under this kind of broad veil of suspicion. And as very often happens when an innocent person gets caught up in the web of the law, all kinds of unexpected and untoward things happened. And I wanted to sort of understand, how did we in the United States end up with a policing system that tolerated such a large number of mistakes? Because this is the extraordinary thing when you look at American policing, is just that how many aggressive police actions are executed against people who are not guilty of any crime whatsoever, haven't committed any kind of crime whatsoever. The system was willing to pull over 100 motorists in order to find one criminal. And that struck me as being the social consequences of playing that kind of game, of angering 99 innocent people in the course of, in the search for one guilty person. That struck me as being a real problem. And I think that's the problem that America has been wrestling with in all this wave of unrest, of just the high number of innocent people who get caught in this web of suspicion.
Yeah, I'd say that one of the elements here that seems to me that comes out of this is that police and others often think of crime as being in that bad neighborhood. It's a bad neighborhood. Let's go patrol it. And the truth is that crime is concentrated on just a few streets in a bad neighborhood. Well, if it's concentrated on a few streets, why are you going everywhere? A New York Times reporter called me and said, well, there's this program in such and such a city. They identified this area as a hotspot, and now they're putting in more police. And I said to myself, that's precisely the opposite of what they should be doing, because it's never the case that a whole neighborhood is a hotspot. And when you send police across a neighborhood, you're intruding in the lives of many, many citizens and increasing the probabilities of the kind of mistakes that Malcolm is talking about.
I mean, oh, go ahead, Barak.
No, it's okay, Malcolm.
No, I just want to say, you know, I think I'm going to blow David's horn for a moment, because he's too modest to do it himself. The core of the insight of David and Larry Sherman, who have been the two criminologists leading this, it's really important to understand how radical it is and how counterintuitive it is. You know, if you pulled over 100 civilians in the street and you asked them about what does crime look like in a city, they would have said, there are areas of the city that are run down, that are full of poverty, that are, drug use, whatever. And those areas are dangerous. And if you said, well, how large are these areas? They would say, well, a dangerous neighborhood might be, they would say the South Bronx, or they would name an area with tens of thousands of people in it. The assumption is that a bad neighborhood is a vast area that has been taken over by crime. And what David has done in his work is to show that intuition we have about how crime can infect an entire area is false. That even in the presence of all kinds of social indications of disorder, unemployment, crime, criminal use, poverty, etc., crime remains something that is unbelievably specific. That instead of thinking of crime-ridden neighborhoods as being block after block after block of dangerousness and criminality, instead we need to understand that even in those areas, crime is going to be something that's going to be tied to a very small number of very specific and predictable street segments. That I still, if you introduce that idea at a dinner party, people will not believe you. You have to go and get the crime maps. I've done this. I have pulled up one of David's crime maps at a dinner party and said, you don't believe me, look at the data, right? This intuition you have carried in your head for your entire life about what crime looks like in an urban area is not supported by the facts, right? And so it's like, and you, David, you've had difficulty even convincing police of this fundamental fact, right?
Yes, and equally, I have to say, in Israel, I've had a few times sitting around a table with chiefs of police, and someone will say, well, if you focus in on those hotspots, crime doesn't just move around because the places nearby don't have the same opportunities. And the police director would say, no, my stomach tells me he's wrong. That was it. Yeah, but I think that when you tell them about it, you start thinking about their daily work because they come to the same places over and over again. It begins to make sense. But it's so much easier for people to, I think, visualize and think about entire neighborhoods. A colleague of mine, Frank Cohn from the University of Cincinnati, in writing something about me said, when I was a teenager, I used to play baseball and I used to walk toward the field in Queens. And I went a certain way where I avoided certain streets because I knew they weren't good and I went around them. He said, and then when I got my PhD in sociology from Columbia, I forgot all that. That was the underlying element.
Yeah.
I would like to bring into the discussion the issue of fairness. Because on one aspect, of course, it is clear that we want the police to be efficient. And as we already heard, there is this brilliant insight of David and his colleagues about coupling, about the fact that displacement of crime is not something that actually happens as we expected. But at the same time, it is obvious to all of us that concentrating police activities in specific areas where that are considered as hotspot might end up with what we call in law as disparate impact on minorities, excessive policing, and things like that. And the question is, how do we reconcile the efficiency argument with the fairness one? And a point that I especially liked in Malcolm's book, it's a point that is not that much accentuated over the book, but he constantly reminds himself, and I ask the readers about the importance of fairness. And there is a nice quote in the book that deals with another aspect, and we will turn to police in a second. Malcolm discusses at length about the fact that judges, like all of us, have this bias of overconfidence in their ability to identify when a person is lying by looking at their faces, at their body movements, and what Malcolm calls a transparency fallacy. And then, and he talks there with the judge, and the judge realizes that Malcolm and the research is of course correct, that he too is biased, and efficiency requires him to avoid bringing the defendant or the witnesses into the courtroom and looking at their face. But he insists on doing that, even at the price of acting inefficiently, because what he feels, in his instinct, as a sense of fairness of the process that is not less important, than the end result. And this is something that I think that, and it comes again and again in Malcolm's discussion, also in the context of discussing the issue of hotspot policing. And I think it's an important issue. It came in David's recent National Academy of Science report about this conflict between the fact that police actually they are doing much better in reducing crime, but nevertheless, they don't get this credit from the public because of this issue of legitimacy of acting fairly. And even before we get to the issue of race and the issue of targeting minorities that is at risk, I would like both of you to comment on this tension between efficiency and fairness in this context.
I'm going to let Malcolm take a bit, because the work he talks about on judges, et cetera, across the book, I think are really important. But let me say something that I think you have to think about this a little bit differently. One element to the fairness question, or legitimacy question, has to do with exercising police authority. Police authority, by definition, is not a good thing. In other words, it's a restraint on our freedoms. The police can stop us, they can talk to us, they can give us a ticket, they have guns and clubs and other things. And we want to reduce that power, if you like, as much as possible. And contrary to what some people have said, it's even been attributed to hotspots that it's led, it's the cause of brutality. It's nonsense. That what hotspots does is it pushes us so that the intrusion in people's lives occur on specific streets. Malcolm, when he was writing the book, and I didn't really understand what this was about at the time, asked me about where this Sarah Bland thing took place. And he wanted me to figure out on the map from the data. So I did. But the point is, Sarah Bland was in a place where there was nothing going on. There was no reason to stop this woman unless she was speeding at 110 miles an hour or doing something else. So one element of this is this concentration reduces the extent to which the police are interfering in people's lives. When you say a bad neighborhood, like that example I told before of a large city, then you start intruding across the entire neighborhood. When you can focus those intrusions, which are problematic, onto specific streets where there's a lot of crime and you have justification, that's important. The other side of that, of course, is what the police do. But I'm going to step back, and I think Malcolm's got a lot to say here. So
yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree. I think a lot depends on when the press writes about this and people complain about this, they're mixing up two things. That if you are someone, let me back up for a moment. One of the observations that David has made is that the difference between a crime-ridden street, one of these hotspots he talks about, and a normal street is not subtle, it's dramatic. I drove around Baltimore, the city with the worst crime rate in America, with someone who has worked with David. And she was showing me the pattern of crime in Baltimore. And there are individual streets, street segments, so blocks in the city of Baltimore that might have, you can correct me if I'm wrong, David, 10 times as much criminal activity as adjacent streets.
More than 10 times.
More than
500 or more crimes.
Yeah, so an order of magnitude more crime than, if you live on one of those streets that has an order of magnitude more crime than neighboring streets, your attitude towards policing is profoundly different than it is if you live on a street with very little crime. You welcome the police. I mean, you are bearing the consequences firsthand of criminal behavior. There are shots being fired outside your front door. You live in fear of going outside. Your children are under daily threat. There's drug dealing, open drug dealing going on your front step. If I said to you there would be an aggressive police presence on your block, you would say good, right? On the other hand, if you live in a street where criminal behavior is negligible, and I said to you there will be police everywhere, you would say that's not good. I don't want my son frisked every time he walks down the street. I don't want, police coming by all night and harassing totally innocent people. Everything depends on what your personal experience is with crime. And when people complain about disproportionate impact and police activity being targeted heavily towards certain communities, what they are talking about is the misapplication of police activity in areas where it's not warranted. I guarantee you the people complaining are not the ones who live on that handful of streets where criminal activity is an order of magnitude higher than neighboring streets. So I think of these ideas as the answer to the complaint about disproportionate impact, not the cause of the complaint about disproportionate impact.
Yes, when you recognize in New York City at the height of the stop, question, frisk situation, there were over 700,000 stops in a year, spread pretty widely across the city, though concentrated a bit more at hotspots, I should note, but still across the city. You can imagine people saying, why are they doing that to me? Especially as many of the places were doing in specific neighborhoods, where most of the people and most of the places in those neighborhoods are not crime-ridden. Most of the people are not at all involved in crime. And that situation, I think, when you spread it across, but I will say something, that there is another element here, and it's sort of in the background, and you're going to get to it more and get to race, and that's the issue of how police authority should be exercised. There have been lots of effort to reduce police violence through training, for example, in the US. But from what we're seeing today, there's a lot of police violence out there, and police use more violence in the US than they do in most other countries. And I should say Americans use more violence than as well in the other countries to create some equivalence. But, I wonder back to this Sarah Bland example. I think in part that one of the things we have to do in American policing is get the police to understand the value of every individual. Every Sarah Bland is important. Every individual is important, as the Talmud would suggest. If the idea of the sanctity of human life and the negative aspect of using violence to that degree was brought forth, I think that could help American policing. That's sort of missing at the moment in the American policing lexicon.
David, I like the idea of sending police officers across the United States to yeshivas to study Talmud. This strikes me as being an improvement on the present training practices.
Well, sometimes it's not about using the police. One of the problems here is lawful but awful policing. The police have powers, legal powers they can use, and they can be awful, legally awful. They can do that's why in a lot of these cases, the police ended up getting away with it, so to speak, or not being prosecuted. It inflames neighborhoods because lawful can be awful. There's something else going on here. And I think that sometimes the training is often about exactly what situation, et cetera. Making people understand the value of human life is critical. I know there's a training program developed by the police chief in Philadelphia, which at the Holocaust Museum, which involved people coming and seeing what happened. And that seems to have had tremendous influence on police understanding the role of police in democracies, et cetera. But there is this normative element of what do they do when they get to these people? Even if they go to a hotspot, they could also alienate the people if they come in like an invading force. I think legitimacy is an important part of it, but that's a second element. The idea of, I think you're absolutely right. The people who are suffering in those very high crime streets, they don't want the police to be defunded. if the police are defunded, they are going to be in deep trouble, and they know it. They don't necessarily want the police to act the way they are now. And that's about a negotiation between the police and the public, because the public ultimately provides legitimacy for the police.
Yeah. I mean, it's worth pointing out that, and you would know better than me, David, my understanding is that police undergo far less training in the United States than in other Western countries. There has been, I think, too little emphasis on preparing police officers for the inherent difficulty of carrying out their task, particularly in a country where there are large, high endemic crime rates and high levels of violence and a lot of guns. You know, being a cop in the United States is a lot harder than being a police officer in Canada, or, you know, Germany. I'm from Canada, and I always, when I go home, the local police force in my mother's hometown in Canada, their slogan, which is on the back of all the police cars, is people helping people. And I always laugh because it's so different from, you know, in New York City, it's to serve and protect. It's a, you know, they're very clearly dealing with a threat. In Canada, it's like the police officer is your friend. You know, he helps you across the street. It's people helping people. You know, so it's like there are some deeper cultural issues that have informed the way police act in the United States that I desperately need attention.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Would you like to comment on this issue of community collaboration, an issue about proactive policing? Just a second.
Yeah, I think that one of the issues here, and I think Malcolm's exactly right, that I'm not sure exact number of hours, but certainly lacking training. When New York City sent young recruits out to do stop, question, and frisk on streets with little experience, that was a terrible mistake. Inexperienced people to stop people on a whole group of streets in the city when the numbers of police overall were declining. It's in some ways, it's hard to imagine how you make those decisions with people with little training and little experience. So there's a distinct problem. I think there's a cultural problem in policing. By the way, there's tremendous variability across 16,000 or more police departments, maybe 1,000 larger police departments. There's tremendous differences, some much better than others, some having more training than others. Yeah, I think this issue of the legitimacy of policing, look, one of the problems in proactive policing is that the police are proactive. They're not being called by citizens, and that's a bit problematic. The way the police need to work in that situation is to explain to citizens why they're coming. Now, quite often on the streets we're talking about, Malcolm, the citizens don't need any explanation for why they're coming. You know, I've been working on something recently, and I'll just mention it, that the study you went to, that you drove around Baltimore with my postdoc at the time, who's now a faculty member in Wyoming, Claire White, in that study, we went to hotspot streets and also to streets with little crime, and we interviewed about over 3,000 people in 3 ways. And one of the things we asked them about is something that sociologists call collective efficacy. Do you trust your neighbors, and are you willing to get together with your neighbors to do something about problems? And what we found was there were tremendous differences in collective efficacy between high and low crime streets. On the high crime streets, less than 50% of people trust their neighbors. On the high crimes, on the high crime streets, less than 50% trust their neighbors. On a low crime street, almost 90% trust their neighbors. And we found this to be a causal influence across time. And that opens the possibility in my mind of thinking about how we could also help these streets, not larger communities, but in the same way you gain an efficiency in hotspots policing, but how we could help these streets so their collective efficacy would grow. And in my mind, if we get people to trust each other, work together with each other, that would not only allow them to better call on the people they need help with. Right now, you call the police for everything, for mental health, for garbage, for whatever it is. A more organized street, like wealthier streets in the city, will look to other resources in the city, etc. But when they do call the police, they'll be better organized to call them, and better organized if the police behave in their street in a way that's unacceptable to them. So I think that, you know, lately we've been thinking about, you know, alternative ways of trying to do something about the crime problem. The police are an essential ingredient Defunding the police is a bad idea in my mind. But there are other mechanisms we can use that capitalize on the hotspots idea, because you can bring a great deal of resources to a small number of streets to help them to be part of reducing the crime problem.
Yeah, there are several questions at the Q&A there, and we'll take a few of them in a second. I just want to return to this more macro level of the discussion and hear your views about that, because there are two stories that we are discussing here. There is one story, I think, which is at the center of our discussion thus far. It is about police acting unprofessionally in one way or another, issues with police mentality, reliance on evidence-based policy and things like that, or lack of thereof, and so forth. And there is this story of racism. And as I understand it, from looking from afar, the more popular notion is that Sandra Bland, as a case study, is more of an issue of race rather than an issue of lack of professionalism from the police. And I understand that David's view is that race is not at the heart of the problem there. I would like to hear your views about the importance of racism in the current crisis that we are facing in terms of police and the popular notion of these cults or defunding police and things like that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that you cannot tell a story of any American mythology without talking about race. It is at the heart of so much of what has gone awry in this country over the last several hundred years. I chose in my book not to dwell on the subject for a number of reasons. One is, I think that it's important for people to understand that racism is manifested in a number of different ways. That there is one form which is, it is something that I hold in my heart that affects the way I behave around another. But there's a much more pernicious side of it, which is that beliefs about the inferiority about others get enshrined in laws, in systems, in patterns of practice, in structures. And there's a very, very interesting argument that has been made by a number of Black intellectuals that by focusing too much on the first kind, the interpersonal racism, what we've done is we have deflected attention from the far more serious task of talking about structural racism, of talking about the ways in which these kinds of attitudes are enshrined in patterns of practice and laws and such. And I wanted to make sure that my book was squarely about institutions, patterns of practices, and laws. And I didn't want to get off on what I considered to be a digression on the question of whether the police officer in the case of Sandra Bland was a racist in his heart. To my mind, that's a secondary question. The primary question was, why was he instructed to behave as he did? And what was the strategy and theory of law enforcement that had been enacted in Texas that permitted a police officer, not just permitted, encouraged a police officer to pull over and harass a perfectly innocent woman in a low crime neighborhood in the middle of the day for no reason? That's the core question. And maybe this guy's a racist in his heart, maybe he isn't. I have no idea. My point is, there are far bigger fish to fry here. And that's where I think we need to be spending our attention. And one of the gratifying things I think about the recent public discussion after George Floyd in this country is how many people are now taking the conversation to that level and willing to discuss this on this broader systemic level. That to me is a sign of real progress.
Yeah, I think Malcolm's absolutely right. And I think part of the question here, part of the problem is the knee-jerk reaction is to say, the problem is the police. A part of the problem is the police, that's for sure. But the question becomes, in my mind, well, what's causing this in the background? And people don't necessarily want to think about that. Most people think they already know the answer. When you use race as the answer, and then you go to the policing, the police are racist, I think it gets away from a greater underlying set of problems in the United States. So let me just put it this way. So the question would be, is it the case that police officers are more likely to shoot Black Americans than white Americans? The simple answer, I guess, is, yeah, Blacks are about 2 to 3 times, 2.5 times more likely to be shot by a police officer or killed by a police officer than you would expect from the proportion of the population. But it's not only that, it's the context. So now you have to ask, if all the other things are taken into account, the context of the shooting, where it occurs, Black Americans are concentrated in certain larger cities, perhaps. Black Americans may be more likely to participate in certain type of drug crime or other activities that make them more likely to come in contact with the police. Now, if that was true, we don't know. The data aren't there. There's an economist at Harvard a few years ago that wrote a paper. He happened to be Black, and he wrote a paper that in which he controlled for a bunch of things and said, you know what, I don't see evidence of race bias in shootings. That doesn't mean there isn't, because there are other studies that sort of suggest there may be. We don't have the data right now, but let's say for a minute that we ask ourselves the question, well, wait a minute, even if it was true that contextual variables explain it, how did Black Americans get into that contextual situation? I mean, that's the element of structural racism in my mind. For over 200 years in the United States, there's been prejudice, racism, reduction of opportunities, segregation, you name it, all these things together. Police have been part of that for sure, but it's part of a much larger system. The police is sort of an end result in that system, perhaps. And I think Malcolm's right. This is, to talk about the policing problem, what happened to Sarah Bland, it's partially about race. Race is the elephant in the room, perhaps, in American life. It's standing there, whatever. But to place it on the police, in my mind, as a police problem particularly, is probably a mistake. It's it may be to a great extent a structural problem, of which the police may be only the sort of last part of a long sieve of the system.
Okay, I'll take a few of the questions from the Q&A here, and they all refer to the idea of hotspot policing. There is one question about evidence, not only about the phenomenon, but also about the policy recommendation. Do we have evidence that this type of policy actually works, of concentrating police activities in these specific areas? And there is this question from the micro level about what is the theory? How come that we see this kind of coupling? Why won't the criminals just move to the next street? Even if we observe it, what is the theory behind it? Why don't they move? And there is a third question along the lines that we already discussed about whether aren't we at the risk of racial profiling, even only from the perspective of subjective understanding of those subject to these heightened policing in this when the crime is concentrated, might not be the case that we will end up with disparate impact and things like that.
Okay, that's an awful lot of questions. The first case is there's very good basic research. Indeed, the sort of, for me, the discovery of this idea of crime concentration in the cities as a law, if you like, I call it the law of crime concentration, comes after I had done research in Seattle and saw that 5% of city streets produce 50% of the crime, and 1% of city streets produce 25%. And then I did the same thing in Tel Aviv, and I found the exact same results. 5% of the streets, or 4.8% of the streets, produce 50% of the crime, and just 1% of the streets produce 25%. So there's a lot of good evidence that crime is concentrated, and therefore what we do about crime should also be concentrated for all the reasons we've spoken about. Since we first developed this idea, Larry Sherman and I did the first randomized experiment in hotspots policing, in which we randomized 120 hotspots to treatment and control areas, and increased police presence in the treatment areas, treatment streets. that showed significant crime reduction. At the time, there weren't many examples of significant crime reduction for police behavior. Now there's over 70 such studies. In the Proactive Policing Report of the National Academy of Sciences, we summarized this if people want to go to the web and look, but they show almost across all of them strong prevention. And importantly, the studies also show that the areas nearby, that crime does not just simply move around the corner, which was the prevailing policing view of the problem before we started doing this, and it took years for police to be able to start accepting this, that it didn't just move around the corner. Well, you don't need a great theory. You could just think logically and locally. If a juvenile crime hotspot is located in the street, it's usually because there's some place, there's an activity space for juveniles, like an arcade or some kind of store or bus stops they all go to get someplace that brings them together to that place. A block away, it may be a residential street. There's nothing for them there. So crime is not just going to move around the corner. And that's an example, but more generally what happens is the crime is located on specific streets that have specific opportunities. The opportunity structures generally vary tremendously street by street. In Seattle, I think it's the avenues running across had a lot of opportunities for the crime. The areas running down didn't. They weren't with the big stores, etc. So yeah, I think this is, once you start thinking about it, it makes a good sense, even though the knee-jerk reaction is there's going to be displacement. By the way, there can be displacement. There can be places where there's an easily displaced area. The police should know that. If two blocks together both have the same opportunity structure, they should be working at both and not only at one. This issue of a disparity of the type you're talking about is very difficult. On the one hand, much of this data is taken from citizens calling the police. If 500 calls are made from citizens about problems on the street, that's a good reason for police to go on the street and do something, right? That's, in a sense, the legitimacy of the police coming to deal with the crime problem. And sometimes, in many cities, getting back to structural racism, the streets where those problems exist may have higher numbers of minority populations. And what I would say to that is that first of all, in doing this, the police should be looked at carefully. Predictive policing models that are not transparent should not be used, because we want to make sure that the reasons the police are going to the street make sense legally and ethically. But another element here is when they go to it seems to me that when they go to those streets, they have to make the case for whether they're work with citizens to do something about it. You can't avoid the reality of America that there's more crime among certain populations. And indeed, let me just say, some of this could be benign. The chief of police in Seattle once said to me, I'd give more police to minority areas because there's a lot more problems in those areas and I want to help them. In the richer, wider areas, they have private police. They don't need me. So that's a benign view. On the other hand, bringing more police to an area increases the probability of arrest and all the sort of unintended negative consequences of policing. Good policing is about thinking about all these things at the same time. It's not taking a simple out and saying, because we end up going the streets with maybe more blacks, we should not do it. Because if there's good reason to do it to help those people, we need to.
Okay, Malcolm, would you like to comment on that?
No, I think I'm in agreement with a lot about what David was talking about. So yeah, let's go to another question.
Yeah, yeah. Well, most of the questions deal with this issue of the last issue of race and the effect that hotspot policing would have on these aspects. By the way, David, the name is Sandra Bland.
Sandra Bland. Did I say Sarah Bland?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Sandra Bland. Sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, what do we want to do? I mean, I think the answer to this question also, and I'd like to hear Malcolm's thoughts more on this issue of race, because I think people would be critical of the kind of approach that he's taking now. I'm not sure. I'd be interested in knowing what's going on, but I think there are two elements of this. One is we can't ignore streets where there are a lot of problems. They need the police. But the police have to come to those streets not as an invading army. They have to come with the assent of the people who live there. They have to work with them to make those streets better. It's also the case we want to think about other avenues to do something about problems in this street besides policing. If there are mental health problems and other problems, there are other agencies of government that should be brought in. And as I've noted before, we want to increase collective efficacy on those streets so the citizens themselves organically can take more control of the crime problems. You know, it's interesting, Malcolm talked before about the streets. I also felt sometimes when I went in those streets afraid. We had multiple shootings that not at our observers, our data collectors, but where they were there, and that's pretty scary. But you know, when we interviewed people on those streets in qualitative interviews, we found that people have a lot of hope for their street. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, before those drug deals come out, the kids play on the street, etc. So I think there are populations here that we should work with, not paternalistically, but in an organic way, through collective efficacy and other ways to help them. The problem that people have sometimes with proactive policing, a Black Lives Matter person said to the National Academy of Sciences panel that I chaired, she said, it's not that we're against policing, it's that we don't want the only thing to be about beating up on people on the street. We want to know that people are concerned about the things that cause these problems in the first place. And I think we could do a lot more thinking about those.
Yeah, I would say, you know, two comments. One is that conceptually, one of the implications of hotspot policing is a move from thinking about crime in terms of people to thinking about crime in terms of place. And this is one of David's big arguments. That's a really, really important conceptual shift, because racism is not about places, it's about people. And the issue of racism comes up when people who are in disadvantaged communities begin to suspect correctly that they are being targeted or discriminated against because of who they are, because of their own background. And when you shift a conversation to say, I am indifferent, I'm agnostic about who is committing the crime, what I care about is where it's being committed. I'm going to use that as my guide to how I use police resources. That is symbolically a very different and much healthier conversation for a society to have. And I think that's and it's what's interesting to me is if you look in other areas as well, if you look at people talking about, there's been some really lovely work done in the field of economics and in public health that has applied the same perspective, that stopped thinking about, say, economic advancement in terms of individuals and start thinking about it in terms of neighborhoods or micro neighborhoods. And it's the same insight. It's like we have gone down this route of trying to predict people's susceptibility to one outcome or another by looking very closely at them, at their own characteristics, nature, background, what have you. And instead we should have been thinking about the immediate environment in which they were situated. And when you understand, for example, that you could have two kids who are in every way identical. One grows up in a very, very troubled neighborhood, one does not. And the kid who does not will have a life outcome that is profoundly different from the kid who is in the troubled neighborhood. You know, it's an obvious observation, but an overlooked one, which is stop obsessing about the personal characteristics of individuals and start obsessing about the characteristics of their environment, right? And that gets us away. That's such a healthier way of thinking about how to solve problems in society. And it gets you out from under the dangerous umbrella of making everything about race.
Yeah, you know, I think that's right.
Pop two more questions, one to David and one to Malcolm. A question to David is whether the fact that we see a concentration of crime also entails the concentration of perpetrators, a small number of perpetrators, or not necessarily. And a question to Malcolm is out there that, do we have research about the possibility of de-biasing our, tendency to, be overconfident in our ability to, to spot who is lying, or other than just being more modest in our abilities?
David?
Yeah, Barak, go back to the question you asked me, because I was thinking of saying something else, but go ahead. What was the question again?
The question was whether the fact that we see a concentration of crime also entails that there is a small number, narrow number of perpetrators or not?
Yeah, I mean, look, the research is that there's a small number of places that produce crime, and there's a small number of people involved, especially in very serious crime. When you get down to serious violent crime, shootings, etc., it's a very, very small number. Both, you can capitalize on both of those things. Those people aren't necessarily in the same block, though quite often they'll operate in the same small areas. If you capitalize both on both of those issues, you can have a big effect in crime. I should note there's a program called Focused Deterrence, in which they capitalize on the idea of a very small number of offenders producing a good deal of crime. But there's another mechanism here that's important, and that mechanism is the following, that we tend to look at a bad neighborhood in a very paternalistic way, quote, bad neighborhood. And we think that that whole neighborhood, all the streets are bad, all the people have problems. That's not the way it is. I think it would help crime prevention a good deal in people's perceptions. They said, you know what, in that neighborhood, it may not be as rich as my neighborhood, but in that neighborhood, there are very few streets that are really problematic, and there are very few people that are involved in doing something about the crime problem. Then we can team up with those neighborhoods, in the broader neighborhoods, in doing something about crime problems. I just want to comment quickly before Malcolm talks that I think both Malcolm and I are saying that the history of American racism, the putting of blacks and segregating specific areas, all adds to these equations we're talking about. And we don't mean to say they're not important. It's an important part of the story, just not the whole story.
And to the question of are there ways to kind of debug the difficulty human beings have with making sense of others? I've looked a little bit at the data about kind of this, about the training, trying to train people out of racist assumptions. And the results of that kind of training does not look terribly promising. It's really, really hard to do. I'm more interested in broader structural things that just make the decision-making job of a police officer easier. So, for example, there are police forces in the United States that have structural incentives for their police officers to resolve problems as quickly as possible. They put you on the clock and they reward you when you dispatch things quickly. You know, that's probably not a good idea, right? Having people speed up in difficult situations is a good way to create more errors. I would rather try and build much more leeway into the system so that the police can slow down when they need to slow down. Similarly, I think that instead of defunding the police, we should think about ways of lightening the load that we place on police officers. It strikes me as kind of crazy that police officers are now the first line of in the United States. They're the people who have primary responsibility with dealing with mental illness and homelessness. They're not trained to do that. The only reason they do that is that as a society in the United States, we have declined to adequately pay for social services that are focused on mental illness and homelessness. So it's like, you know, we created this problem, you know, in part by our unwillingness to create a properly focused social safety net for many troubled people in our society. You know, a really good way to improve police performance would be to say, we're taking away two of the most onerous and complex things from your portfolio, right? Focus on what you know best how to do. And all research in any professional realm says that if you allow experts to focus on what they do best, what they know best, results will improve, right? You know, so I think there's a number of ways in which we can attack this problem without having to do the impossible, which is cleanse the hearts of police officers of any hint of prejudice.
I knew I can count on you that you will be able to end up with an optimistic note. Thank you so much, Malcolm and David, for sharing your insight with us. We are really grateful for your participation in this discussion. I apologize for those of you in the audience that we were not able to answer all the questions, but I hope that we did gain important insight for this discussion. Maura, please you conclude. Maura.
I just want to give a special thank you to our speakers for helping us better understand the challenges and some new perspectives in policing, criminology, and the law. Thank you to our guests for joining us for this critically and timely conversation and for giving us the opportunity to highlight the significance and global impact of the Hebrew University and its Faculty of Law. In the law, the humanities, medicine, science, technology, and many other fields, Hebrew University is helping create a better future for Israelis and people around the globe. We celebrate its accomplishments, and we thank our donors for helping make this all possible. Please visit afhu.org for more information about ways to become involved. One of the ways to help support our esteemed Faculty of Law is by participating in our milestone 50th annual George A. Katz Torch of Learning Award celebration on September 15th at 12 noon. We are honoring Martin Lipton, co-founder of Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz, and recognizing past award laureates, and our guest speaker is Ambassador Dennis Ross. We'd be delighted to have you join us. Thank you again, and best wishes from all of us at AFHU for your health and safety.
Thank you. Bye-bye.